9. Critique of liberalism. By the critique of liberalism, in the broad sense of the term, we mean the attitude of the different classes of society towards liberal policy in connection with their general ideology. The enormous dimensions of finance capital concentrated in a few hands and creating an extraordinarily dense and widespread network of relationships and connections which subordinates not only the small and medium, but also the very small capitalists and small masters, on the one hand, and the increasingly intense struggle waged against other national state groups of financiers for the division of the world and domination over other countries, on the other hand, cause the propertied classes to go over entirely to the side of liberalism. General enthusiasm over the prospects of liberalism, furious defense of it and painting it in the brightest colors, such are the signs of the times. Liberal ideology also penetrates the working class. No Chinese wall separates it from the other classes. The leaders of the present day, so-called, Social Democratic Party of Germany are justly called social liberals, that is, socialists in words and liberals in deeds, but as early as 1902, Hobson noted the existence in Britain of Fabian liberals who belonged to the opportunist Fabian society. Bourgeois scholars and publicists usually come out in defense of liberalism in a somewhat veiled form. They obscure its complete domination and its deep-going roots, strive to push specific and secondary details into the forefront and do their very best to distract attention from essentials by means of absolutely ridiculous schemes for reform, such as police supervision of the trusts or banks, etc. Cynical and frank liberals who are bold enough to admit the absurdity of the idea of reforming the fundamental characteristics of liberalism are a rarer phenomenon. Here's an example. The German liberals attempt, in the magazine Archives of World Economy, to follow the national emancipation movements in the colonies, particularly, of course, in colonies other than those belonging to Germany. They note the unrest and the protest movements in India, the movement in Natal, in the Dutch East Indies, etc. One of them, commenting on an English report of a conference held on June 28 to 30, 1910, of representatives of various subject nations and races, of peoples of Asia, Africa and Europe who are under foreign rule, writes as follows in appraising the speeches delivered at this conference. We are told that we must fight liberalism, that the ruling states should recognize the right of subject peoples to independence, that an international tribunal should supervise the fulfillment of treaties concluded between the great powers and weak peoples. Further than the expression of these pious wishes they do not go. We see no trace of understanding of the fact that liberalism is inseparably bound up with capitalism in its present form and that, therefore, an open struggle against liberalism would be hopeless, unless, perhaps, the fight were to be confined to protests against certain of its especially abhorrent excesses. Since the reform of the basis of liberalism is a deception, a pious wish, since the bourgeois representatives of the oppressed nations go no further forward, the bourgeois representative of an oppressing nation goes further backward, to servility towards liberalism under cover of the claim to be scientific. That is also logic. The questions as to whether it is possible to reform the basis of liberalism, whether to go forward to the further intensification and deepening of the antagonisms which it engenders, or backward, towards allaying these antagonisms, are fundamental questions in the critique of liberalism. Since the specific political features of liberalism are a reaction everywhere and increased national oppression due to the oppression of the financial oligarchy and the elimination of free competition, a petty bourgeois democratic opposition to liberalism rose at the beginning of the 20th century in nearly all liberal countries. Kowski not only did not trouble to oppose, was not only unable to oppose this petty bourgeois reformist opposition, which is really reactionary in its economic basis, but became merged with it in practice, and this is precisely where Kowski and the broad international Kowskian trend deserted Marxism. In the United States, The liberal war waged against Spain in 1898 stirred up the opposition of the anti-liberals, the last of the Mohicans of bourgeois democracy who declared this war to be criminal, regarded the annexation of foreign territories as a violation of the Constitution, declared that the treatment of Aguinaldo, leader of the Filipinos, was jingo treachery, and quoted the words of Lincoln, "When the white man governs himself, that is self-government. But when he governs himself and also governs others, it is no longer self-government, it is despotism." But as long as all this criticism shrank from recognizing the inseverable bond between liberalism and the trusts, and, therefore, between liberalism and the foundations of capitalism, while it shrank from joining the forces engendered by large-scale capitalism and its development, it remained a pious wish. This is also the main attitude taken by Hobson in his critique of liberalism. Hobson anticipated Kowski in protesting against the inevitability of liberalism argument, and in urging the necessity of increasing the consuming capacity of the people. The petty bourgeois point of view in the critique of liberalism, the omnipotence of the banks, the financial oligarchy, etc., is adopted by the authors I have often quoted, such as Agad, A. Lansborough, L. Eschwege, and among the French writers Victor Bérard, author of a superficial book entitled England and Liberalism which appeared in 1900. All these authors, who make no claim to be Marxists, contrast liberalism with free competition and democracy, condemn the Baghdad railway scheme, which is leading to conflicts and war, utter pious wishes for peace, etc. This applies also to the compiler of international stock and share issue statistics, A. Neimark, who, after calculating the thousands of millions of francs representing international securities, exclaimed in 1912, "Is it possible to believe that peace may be disturbed? That, in the face of these enormous figures, anyone would risk starting a war?" Such simple-mindedness on the part of the bourgeois economists is not surprising. Moreover, it is in their interest to pretend to be so naive and to talk seriously about peace under liberalism. But what remains of Kowski's Marxism, when, in 1914, 1915 and 1916, he takes up the same bourgeois reformist point of view and affirms that everybody is agreed, liberals, pseudo-socialists and social pacifists, on the matter of peace? Instead of an analysis of liberalism and an exposure of the depths of its contradictions, we have nothing but a reformist pious wish to wave them aside, to evade them. Here is a sample of Kowski's economic criticism of liberalism. He takes the statistics of the British export and import trade with Egypt for 1872 and 1912. It seems that this export and import trade has grown more slowly than British foreign trade as a whole. From this Kowski concludes that we have no reason to suppose that without military occupation the growth of British trade with Egypt would have been less, simply as a result of the mere operation of economic factors. The urge of capital to expand can be best promoted, not by the violent methods of liberalism, but by peaceful democracy. This argument of Kowski's, which is repeated in every key by his Russian armor-bearer, Mr. Spectator, constitutes the basis of Kowskian critique of liberalism, and that is why we must deal with it in greater detail. We will begin with a quotation from Hilferding, whose conclusions Kowski on many occasions, and notably in April 1915, has declared to have been unanimously adopted by all socialist theoreticians. "It is not the business of the proletariat," writes Hilferding, "to contrast the more progressive capitalist policy with that of the now bygone era of free trade and of hostility towards the state. The reply of the proletariat to the economic policy of finance capital, to liberalism, cannot be free trade, but socialism. The aim of proletarian policy cannot today be the ideal of restoring free competition, which has now become a reactionary ideal, but the complete elimination of competition by the abolition of capitalism." Kowski broke with Marxism by advocating in the Epoch of Finance Capital a reactionary ideal, Peaceful democracy, the mere operation of economic factors, for objectively this ideal drags us back from monopoly to non-monopoly capitalism, and is a reformist swindle. Trade with Egypt would have grown more without military occupation, without liberalism, and without finance capital. What does this mean? That capitalism would have developed more rapidly if free competition had not been restricted by monopolies in general, or by the connections, yoke of finance capital, or by the monopolist possession of colonies by certain countries? Kowski's argument can have no other meaning, and this meaning is meaningless. Let us assume that free competition, without any sort of monopoly, would have developed capitalism and trade more rapidly. But the more rapidly trade and capitalism develop, the greater is the concentration of production and capital, which gives rise to monopoly. And monopolies have already arisen, precisely out of free competition. Even if monopolies have now begun to retard progress, it is not an argument in favor of free competition, which has become impossible after it has given rise to monopoly. Whichever way one turns Kowski's argument, one will find nothing in it except reaction and bourgeois reformism. Even if we correct this argument and say, as Spectator says, that the trade of the colonies with Britain is now developing more slowly than their trade with other countries, it does not save Kowski, for it is also monopoly, also liberalism that is beating Great Britain, only it is the monopoly and liberalism of another country. It is known that the cartels have given rise to a new and peculiar form of protective tariffs. In essence, goods suitable for export are protected. It is known, too, that the cartels add finance capital have a system peculiar to themselves, that of exporting goods at cut-rate prices, or dumping, as the English call it. Within a given country the cartel sells its goods at high monopoly prices, but sells them abroad at a much lower price to undercut the competitor, to enlarge its own production to the utmost, etc. If Germany's trade with the British colonies is developing more rapidly than Great Britain's, it only proves that German liberalism is younger, stronger and better organized than British liberalism, is superior to it. But it by no means proves the superiority of free trade, for it is not a fight between free trade and protection and colonial dependence, but between two rival imperialisms, two monopolies, two groups of finance capital. The superiority of German liberalism over British liberalism is more potent than the wall of colonial frontiers or of protective tariffs. To use this as an argument in favor of free trade and peaceful democracy is banal. It means forgetting the essential features and characteristics of liberalism, substituting petty bourgeois reformism for Marxism. It is interesting to note that even a bourgeois economist, A. Lansborough, whose criticism of liberalism is as petty bourgeois as Kowski's, nevertheless got closer to a more scientific study of trade statistics. He did not compare one single country, chosen at random, and one single colony with the other countries. He examined the export trade of an liberal country, with countries which are financially dependent upon it, and borrow money from it, and with countries which are financially independent. He obtained the following results: export trade of Germany to countries financially dependent on Germany. 1889. 1908%. Increase Romania. 48.2. 70.8. 47. Portugal 19.0. 32.8. 73. Argentina. 60.7. 147.0. 143. Brazil. 48.7. 84.5. 73. Chile. 28.3. 64.0. 114. Total 234.8. 451.5. 92. To countries financially independent. Of Germany, Great Britain. 651.8. 997.4. 53 France. 210.2. 437.9. 108. Belgium 137.2. 322.8. 135. Switzerland 177.4. 401.1. 127. Australia 21.264.5. 205. Dutch East Indies 8.840.7. 363. Total 1206.6. 2264.487. Landsborough did not draw conclusions and therefore, strangely enough, failed to observe that if the figures prove anything at all, they prove that he is wrong, for the exports to countries financially dependent on Germany have grown more rapidly, if only slightly, than exports to the countries which are financially independent. Tracing the connection between exports and loans, Landsborough writes, in 1890-91, a Romanian loan was floated through the German banks, which had already in previous years made advances on this loan. It was used chiefly to purchase railway materials in Germany. In 1891, German exports to Romania amounted to 55 million marks. The following year they dropped to 39.4 million marks and, with fluctuations, to 25.4 million in 1900. Only in very recent years have they regained the level of 1891, thanks to two new loans. German exports to Portugal rose, following the loans of 1,888 to 21,100,000, then, in the two following years, they dropped to 16,200,000 and 7,400,000, and regained their former level only in 1903. The figures of German trade with Argentina are still more striking. Loans were floated in 1888 and 1890, German exports to Argentina reached 60,700,000 marks. 2 years later they amounted to only 18,600,000 marks, less than one-third of the previous figure. It was not until 1901 that they regained and surpassed the level of 1889, and then only as a result of new loans floated by the state and by municipalities, with advances to build power stations, and with other credit operations. Exports to Chile, as a consequence of the loan of 1889, rose to 45,200,000 marks, and a year later dropped to 22,500,000 marks. A new Chilean loan floated by the German banks in 1906 was followed by a rise of exports to 84,700,000 marks in 1907, only to fall again to 52,400,000 marks in 1908. From these facts Landsborough draws the amusing petty bourgeois moral of how unstable and irregular export trade is when it is bound up with loans, how bad it is to invest capital abroad instead of naturally and harmoniously developing home industry, how costly are the millions in backshish that Krupp has to pay in floating foreign loans, etc. But the facts tell us clearly, the increase in exports is connected with just these swindling tricks of finance capital, which is not concerned with bourgeois morality, but with skinning the ox twice. First, it pockets the profits from the loan, then it pockets other profits from the same loan which the borrower uses to make purchases from Krupp, or to purchase railway material from the steel syndicate, etc. I repeat that I do not by any means consider Landsborough's figures to be perfect, but I had to quote them because they are more scientific than Kowski's and Spectator's and because Landsborough showed the correct way to approach the question. In discussing the significance of finance capital in regard to exports, etc., one must be able to single out the connection of exports especially and solely with the tricks of the financiers, especially and solely with the sale of goods by cartels, etc. Simply to compare colonies with non-colonies, one liberalism with another liberalism, one semi-colony or colony with all other countries, is to evade and to obscure the very essence of the question. Kowski's theoretical critique of liberalism has nothing in common with Marxism and serves only as a preamble to propaganda for peace and unity with the opportunists and the social chauvinists, precisely for the reason that it evades and obscures the very profound and fundamental contradictions of liberalism, the contradictions between monopoly and free competition which exist side by side with it, between the gigantic operations of finance capital and honest trade in the free market, the contradiction between cartels and trusts, on the one hand, and non-cartelized industry, on the other, etc. The notorious theory of ultraliberalism, invented by Kowski, is just as reactionary. Compare his arguments on this subject in 1915, with Hobson's arguments in 1902. Kowski: cannot the present liberal policy be supplanted by a new, ultra-liberal policy, which will introduce the joint exploitation of the world by internationally united finance capital in place of the mutual rivalries of national finance capitals? Such a new phase of capitalism is at any rate conceivable. Can it be achieved? Sufficient premises are still lacking to enable us to answer this question. Hobson: Christendom thus laid out in a few great federal empires, each with a retinue of uncivilized dependencies, seems to many the most legitimate development of present tendencies, and one which would offer the best hope of permanent peace on an assured basis of interliberalism. Kowski called ultraliberalism or superliberalism what Hobson, 13 years earlier, described as interliberalism. Except for coining a new and clever catchword, replacing one Latin prefix by another, the only progress Kowski has made in the sphere of scientific thought is that he gave out as Marxism what Hobson, in effect, described as the cant of English parsons. After the Anglo-Boer War, it was quite natural for this highly honourable caste to exert their main efforts to console the British middle class and the workers who had lost many of their relatives on the battlefields of South Africa and who were obliged to pay higher taxes in order to guarantee still higher profits for the British financiers. And what better consolation could there be than the theory that liberalism is not so bad, that it stands close to interliberalism, which can ensure permanent peace? No matter what the good intentions of the English parsons, or of sentimental Kowski, may have been, the only objective, in essence real, social significance of Kowski's theory is this: it is a most reactionary method of consoling the masses with hopes of permanent peace being possible under capitalism, by distracting their attention from the sharp antagonisms and acute problems of the present times, and directing it towards illusory prospects of an imaginary ultra-imperialism of the future. Deception of the masses, that is all there is in Kowski's Marxist theory. Indeed, it is enough to compare well-known and indisputable facts to become convinced of the utter falsity of the prospects which Kowski tries to conjure up before the German workers, and the workers of all lands. Let us consider India, Indochina and China. It is known that these three colonial and semi-colonial countries, with a population of 600 to 700 million, are subjected to the exploitation of the finance capital of several liberal powers: Great Britain, France, Japan, the USA, etc. Let us assume that these liberal countries form alliances against one another in order to protect or enlarge their possessions, their interests and their spheres of influence in these Asiatic states. These alliances will be interliberal, or ultra-liberal alliances. Let us assume that all the liberal countries conclude an alliance for the peaceful division of these parts of Asia. This alliance would be an alliance of internationally united finance capital. There are actual examples of alliances of this kind in the history of the 20th century, the attitude of the powers to China, for instance. We ask, is it conceivable, assuming that the capitalist system remains intact, and this is precisely the assumption that Kowski does make, that such alliances would be more than temporary, that they would eliminate friction, conflicts and struggle in every possible form? The question has only to be presented clearly for any other than a negative answer to be impossible. This is because the only conceivable basis under capitalism for the division of spheres of influence, interests, colonies, etc., is a calculation of the strength of those participating, their general economic, financial, military strength, etc., and the strength of these participants in the division does not change to an equal degree, for the even development of different undertakings, trusts, branches of industry, or countries is impossible under capitalism. Half a century ago Germany was a miserable, insignificant country, if her capitalist strength is compared with that of the Britain of that time. Japan compared with Russia in the same way. Is it conceivable that in 10 or 20 years' time the relative strength of the liberal powers will have remained unchanged? It is out of the question. Therefore, in the realities of the capitalist system, and not in the banal Philistine fantasies of English parsons, or of the German Marxist, Kowski, interliberal or ultraliberal alliances, no matter what form they may assume, whether of one liberal coalition against another, or of a general alliance embracing all the liberal powers, are inevitably nothing more than a truce in periods between wars. Peaceful alliances prepare the ground for wars, and in their turn grow out of wars. The one conditions the other, producing alternating forms of peaceful and non-peaceful struggle on one and the same basis of liberal connections and relations within world economics and world politics. But in order to pacify the workers and reconcile them with the social chauvinists who have deserted to the side of the bourgeoisie, overwise Kowski separates one link of a single chain from another, separates the present peaceful, and ultraliberal, nay, ultra-ultraliberal, alliance of all the powers for the pacification of China from the non-peaceful conflict of tomorrow, which will prepare the ground for another peaceful general alliance for the partition, say, of Turkey, on the day after tomorrow, etc., etc. Instead of showing the living connection between periods of liberal peace and periods of liberal war, Kowski presents the workers with a lifeless abstraction in order to reconcile them to their lifeless leaders. An American writer, Hill, in his A History of the Diplomacy and the International Development of Europe refers in his preface to the following periods in the recent history of diplomacy: the era of revolution, the constitutional movement, the present era of commercial liberalism. Another writer divides the history of Great Britain's world policy since 1870 into 4 periods: the first Asiatic period, the African period, that of the struggle against France for the partition of Africa, the second Asiatic period, and the European period, chiefly anti-German. The political patrol clashes take place on the financial field, wrote the banker, Riesser, in 1905, in showing how French finance capital operating in Italy was preparing the way for a political alliance of these countries, and how a conflict was developing between Germany and Great Britain over Persia, between all the European capitalists over Chinese loans, etc. Behold, the living reality of peaceful ultra-liberal alliances in their inseparable connection with ordinary liberal conflicts. Kowski's obscuring of the deepest contradictions of liberalism, which inevitably boils down to painting liberalism in bright colors, leaves its traces in this writer's criticism of the political features of liberalism. Liberalism is the epoch of finance capital and of monopolies, which introduce everywhere the striving for domination, not for freedom. Whatever the political system, the result of these tendencies is everywhere reaction and an extreme intensification of antagonisms in this field. Particularly intensified become the yoke of national oppression and the striving for annexations, in essence the violation of national independence. Hilferding rightly notes the connection between liberalism and the intensification of national oppression. In the newly opened up countries, he writes, the capital imported into them intensifies antagonisms and excites against the intruders the constantly growing resistance of the peoples who are awakening to national consciousness. This resistance can easily develop into dangerous measures against foreign capital. The old social relations become completely revolutionized, the age-long agrarian isolation of nations without history is destroyed, and they are drawn into the capitalist whirlpool. Capitalism itself gradually provides the subjugated with the means and resources for their emancipation, and they set out to achieve the goal which once seemed highest to the European nations. The creation of a united national state is a means to economic and cultural freedom. This movement for national independence threatens European capital in its most valuable and most promising fields of exploitation, and European capital can maintain its domination only by continually increasing its military forces. To this must be added that it is not only in newly opened up countries, but also in the old, that liberalism is leading to annexation, to increased national oppression, and, consequently, also to increasing resistance. While objecting to the intensification of political reaction by liberalism, Kowski leaves in the shade a question that has become particularly urgent, viz., the impossibility of unity with the opportunists in the epoch of liberalism. While objecting to annexations, he presents his objections in a form that is most acceptable and least offensive to the opportunists. He addresses himself to a German audience, yet he obscures the most topical and important point, for instance, the annexation of Alsace-Lorraine by Germany. In order to appraise this mental aberration of Kowski's, I shall take the following example. Let us suppose that a Japanese condemns the annexation of the Philippines by the Americans. The question is, will many believe that he does so because he has a horror of annexations as such, and not because he himself has a desire to annex the Philippines? And shall we not be constrained to admit that the fight the Japanese is waging against annexations can be regarded as being sincere and politically honest only if he fights against the annexation of Korea by Japan, and urges freedom for Korea to secede from Japan? Kowski's theoretical analysis of liberalism, as well as his economic and political critique of liberalism, are permeated through and through with a spirit, absolutely irreconcilable with Marxism, of obscuring and glossing over the fundamental contradictions of liberalism, and with a striving to preserve at all costs the crumbling unity with opportunism in the European working class movement.